Download this code from codegive.com, link in the description below. In database design, particularly in the context of entity relationship, modeling, entities can be classified into two types, strong entities and weak entities. Understanding the distinction between these two types of entities is crucial for designing efficient and normalized database schemas. Strong entities. A strong entity is an entity that can exist independently of other entities. It has a primary key that uniquely identifies each instance of the entity. Strong entities do not rely on any other entity for their identification. Characteristics of strong entities: have a primary key that uniquely identifies each record. Can exist independently in the database. Example: consider a customer entity in a retail database. Each customer can be uniquely identified by a customer ID. Weak entities. A weak entity is an entity that cannot be uniquely identified by its own attributes alone. It relies on a strong or owner entity for its identification. Weak entities do not have a primary key, instead, they have a partial key that, along with the primary key of the owning entity, can uniquely identify them. Characteristics of weak entities: do not have a primary key, they rely on a strong entity's key. Have a partial key that helps in conjunction with a strong entity to identify instances. Represent a relationship where instances of the weak entity are dependent on instances of the strong entity. Example: consider an order entity that is associated with a customer. An order cannot exist without a customer, and therefore, it is a weak entity. The order ID cannot uniquely identify an order without the customer ID. Diagram representation. In diagrams, strong entities are represented by rectangles. Weak entities are represented by double rectangles. The relationship between strong and weak entities is often depicted with a double diamond. Example code. Let's illustrate strong and weak entities using SQL code to create tables. SQL example. Explanation of the code. 1. Customer table. Customer ID is the primary key, which uniquely identifies each customer. This table represents a strong entity because it can exist independently. 2. Order table. Order ID and customer ID together form a composite primary key, indicating that an order is identified not just by the order ID, but also by the customer to whom it belongs. The customer ID column acts as a foreign key that references the customer table. This establishes the relationship between the weak entity, order, and the strong entity, customer. The order table is a weak entity because its existence is dependent on the customer entity. Use cases. Use strong entities when the entity can stand alone and is not dependent on another entity. Use weak entities when the entity's existence is linked to another entity, typically in scenarios where the relationship is essential for identification. Conclusion. Understanding the concepts of strong and weak entities is fundamental in designing a relational database. Strong entities are self-sufficient, while weak entities depend on strong entities for their identity. This distinction is critical for establishing appropriate relationships and ensuring data integrity within the database.